The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Lincoln Elementary School as 12-year-old Kayla Johnson adjusted her backpack straps and began her familiar walk home. The weight of textbooks pressed against her spine, but she welcomed this peaceful transition from the chaos of classroom bells and hallway chatter to the quiet comfort of her neighborhood streets. Her sneakers crunched softly against the gravel path that bordered the school's meticulously maintained lawn, where maintenance crews had just finished their weekly trimming. The scent of fresh-cut grass filled the air, mixing with the distant aroma of someone's barbecue and the exhaust from cars picking up students. Kayla breathed deeply, savoring these few minutes of solitude before she'd reach home, where homework and chores awaited. She was halfway to the front gate when something caught her peripheral vision that made her stomach clench with indignation. A police officer stood near the school entrance, his imposing frame leaning casually against his patrol car's hood. The afternoon light glinted off his badge, and the radio clipped to his shoulder. He took a long, deliberate drag from his cigarette, tilted his head back slightly, and exhaled a thin stream of smoke into the clean air. Then, with the kind of casual indifference that spoke of someone accustomed to doing whatever he pleased, he flicked the cigarette but directly onto the school's carefully tended grass. The still smoldering cigarette landed among the green blades like a small act of vandalism, its orange ember glowing against the pristine lawn. Kayla stopped dead in her tracks, her young mind processing what she'd just witnessed. Her parents had raised her with clear principles about right and wrong, and her father especially had drilled one lesson into her consciousness. Wrong is wrong, no matter who does it, Kayla. Badge, uniform, fancy suit, none of that changes what's right. She glanced around, hoping someone else had seen what happened, someone older who might step forward. But the other students were absorbed in their own conversations, walking past without noticing the small act of disrespect that had just occurred on their school grounds. The maintenance crew was already loading their equipment into trucks, ready to head home after a day of keeping the school beautiful. Kayla's heart began to pound, but her father's voice echoed in her memory. He'd always taught her that staying silent when witnessing wrongdoing made you complicit in it. She thought about all the times he'd told her stories about standing up to bullies, about speaking truth to power, about how real strength came from doing what's right even when it's difficult. Taking a deep breath that filled her lungs with determination, Kayla approached the officer. Her voice came out steadier than she felt inside, carrying the clear conviction of someone raised to believe in justice. "Sir, you're not supposed to litter here. This is the school lawn." The officer's head turned slowly toward her, his movement deliberate and predatory. His eyes narrowed as they sized her up, like she was some insignificant insect that had dared to crawl across his polished boots. The look on his face wasn't just surprise or annoyance. It was the kind of cold disdain that immediately communicated how little he thought of her, her opinion, and her right to speak to him at all. "What did you just say, girl?" His tone was sharp and condescending, each word dripping with the kind of authority that expected immediate submission. The way he emphasized girl carried undertones that made Kayla's skin crawl, but she forced herself to stand straighter rather than shrink away. Despite the trembling that had started in her hands, Kayla maintained eye contact. She could feel her pulse quickening, but her father's lessons about courage gave her strength. "I said you shouldn't litter. It's against the rules." Her voice carried the moral certainty of youth, unmarked by the cynicism that comes from years of witnessing injustice go unpunished. The officer pushed himself off his patrol car with deliberate slowness, his boots crunching against the gravel as he took a step closer. He towered over her small frame, using his physical presence as an intimidation tactic. The acrid scent of cigarette smoke clung to his uniform, mixing with the smell of leather from his belt and something else, the stale odor of someone who spent too much time in confined spaces, marinating in his own authority. "You think you can tell me what to do?" His voice dropped to a menacing whisper that still carried across the space between them. "You know who I am." The question wasn't really a question. It was a statement of power, a reminder of the hierarchy he believed governed their interaction. But Kayla had been raised by parents who understood that real authority came from moral conviction, not from uniforms or weapons. Her chin lifted slightly as she met his intimidating stare. "I know you're supposed to set an example." Her voice trembled just slightly, but she refused to let fear silence her conscience. The officer let out a short, mocking laugh that contained no warmth or humor. He tilted his head like she was some amusing curiosity, a child playing at being an adult. But behind the laughter was something darker, the kind of rage that came from someone unused to having their authority questioned, especially by someone he clearly considered beneath his notice. "Where's your respect, huh?" His words began to carry an edge that went beyond simple irritation. "Maybe where you come from. People talk to cops like that, but not here." The emphasis on "where you come from" hung in the air like a toxic cloud, loaded with implications that made Kayla's stomach tighten with a new kind of understanding. This wasn't just about littering anymore. This was about something much deeper and more dangerous. Kayla felt the weight of the officer's words settling around her like a suffocating blanket. The phrase "where you come from" echoed in her mind, carrying implications that her young but perceptive consciousness immediately recognized. She'd heard similar coded language before, in whispered conversations between adults, in news stories her parents watched with grim expressions, in the cautionary tales shared within her community about interactions with law enforcement. But instead of backing down, something fierce and protective rose up inside her chest. Her father's face flashed in her mind, not just his gentle smile when he tucked her in at night, but the steel in his eyes when he talked about standing up for what's right. "My dad taught me to speak up when something's wrong," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He's not afraid of anyone, and neither am I." The transformation in the officer's expression was immediate and chilling. His mock amusement melted away, replaced by something much more dangerous. His smirk deepened into something meaner, more personal. He stepped even closer, invading her personal space with the practiced ease of someone who had used intimidation as a tool throughout his career. "And who's your daddy?" The question dripped with contempt and challenge. "Some wannabe tough guy." His voice carried the sing-song quality of someone mocking a child, but underneath was genuine malice. He was enjoying this confrontation, feeding off the power dynamic he believed he controlled completely. Kayla's response came without hesitation, spoken with the simple pride of a daughter who idolized her father. "My dad's Mike Tyson, and he's a hero." The officer's reaction was immediate and explosive. Laughter burst from his lips, not the nervous chuckle of someone caught off guard, but the full-throated guffaws of someone who found the situation absolutely hilarious. He shook his head like he'd just heard the funniest joke of his life. "Yeah, sure," he said between laughs, wiping imaginary tears from his eyes. "And I'm the President of the United States. What? You think dropping a famous name is going to scare me?" His voice took on a mocking, high-pitched tone as he continued. "Tyson, huh? Probably just another washed-up fighter. Name means nothing to me." But as he spoke, something shifted in his demeanor. The laughter was still there, but it had taken on a harder edge. Perhaps it was the way Kayla stood her ground, the complete lack of fear in her eyes when she mentioned her father's name. Maybe it was the growing crowd of students who had begun to slow their walking, sensing drama unfolding. Or perhaps it was simply that his ego couldn't tolerate any challenge, no matter how small. He stepped even closer, his shadow falling across her face like a physical presence. The smell of stale cigarettes and bitter coffee on his breath mixed with something else, the sour scent of aggression and barely controlled rage. "You think you're special because of him." His voice had dropped to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "Let me teach you something about respect." Kayla's pulse quickened as every instinct screamed at her to run. The rational part of her brain recognized the danger she was in, alone with an increasingly aggressive authority figure who clearly had no intention of de-escalating the situation. But her feet remained planted firmly on the ground, held in place by the same stubborn courage that had started this confrontation. She could see the hard line of his jaw, the way his hands had begun to clench and unclench at his sides, the glint in his eyes that spoke of someone who had moved far beyond mere authority into something much more personal and vindictive. This wasn't about law enforcement anymore. This was about power, control, and the desire to crush someone smaller. The world seemed to slow down as she watched his hand rise. Time stretched like taffy as his palm moved through the air toward her face. She had enough time to see the calluses on his fingers, to notice the way the afternoon light caught the wedding ring on his hand, to wonder absurdly if he had children of his own at home. Then his hand connected with her cheek. The slap cracked through the air like a gunshot, the sound seeming to echo off the school buildings and bounce back from the trees. Pain bloomed instantly across her face. Hot, shocking, and completely overwhelming. The force of the blow made her head snap to one side, her vision blurring momentarily as tears sprang to her eyes. For a split second that felt like an eternity, the entire world went silent. The shouts of students in the distance faded to nothing. The hum of passing cars disappeared. Even the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze seemed muted. All that existed was the burning sensation across her cheek and the metallic taste of blood where she'd bitten her tongue. The officer leaned down, bringing his face close to hers, his voice low and taunting. "Now you'll remember who's in charge." His breath was hot against her ear, carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed he'd just taught an important lesson about the natural order of things. Kayla swallowed hard, fighting back tears that threatened to spill down her burning cheek. When she spoke, her voice was trembling but still defiant. "When my dad finds out—" "Your dad's not here," the officer interrupted, straightening up with renewed confidence. His smirk had returned, wider and more self-satisfied than before. "And even if he was, what's he going to do? I'm the law." But before Kayla could form a response, before the officer could continue his taunting, a sound cut through the air that changed everything. It was a voice, deep, unmistakable, and filled with the kind of fury that made the very air vibrate with danger. "Get your hands off my daughter." The officer's head snapped toward the voice like he'd been struck by lightning. Kayla turned as well, relief flooding through her chest so powerfully that her knees almost buckled. There, striding toward them with the controlled fury of a predator, was Mike Tyson himself. Mike Tyson's approach was like watching a force of nature in motion. Each step was deliberate and measured, his broad shoulders moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades turning physical confrontation into an art form. His eyes were locked onto the officer with the unwavering focus of an apex predator that had just spotted prey, threatening his offspring. The afternoon sun seemed to bend around his imposing frame as he closed the distance between himself and the man who had dared to lay hands on his daughter. Students who had been walking past stopped mid-conversation, their mouths falling open as they recognized the legendary boxer. Phones appeared as if by magic, held by trembling hands as young people realized they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Mike's fists were clenching and unclenching at his sides, a telltale sign that Kayla recognized from their training sessions in the home gym. It was his body's way of containing energy that wanted desperately to be released, like a dam holding back a raging river. The veins in his forearms were visible beneath his skin, testament to the strength that was being held in check only by his iron self-control. He reached Kayla in moments that felt both eternal and instantaneous, immediately positioning his massive frame between her and the officer who had struck her. The protective instinct was so natural, so automatic, that it seemed like the most inevitable thing in the world. His presence didn't just shield her physically. It created a barrier of safety that she could feel in her bones. The officer, despite his earlier bravado, took an involuntary step backward. Recognition was dawning in his eyes, not just of Mike's identity, but of the magnitude of his mistake. Still, his training and ego warred against the wisdom of retreat. "She was mouthing off," he said quickly, his voice higher than before, but still attempting to maintain authority. "I was teaching her a lesson." Mike's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You don't touch my daughter. Ever." Each word was pronounced with careful precision, like he was explaining a fundamental law of physics that brooked no argument or negotiation. The tension between the two men was thick enough to cut with a knife. Around them, the crowd of students was growing larger, drawn by some primitive instinct that recognized when something significant was happening. Phones were held high, recording from multiple angles as social media began to buzz with fragments of what was unfolding. The officer's hand twitched toward his belt, a movement so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed it. But Mike Tyson had spent his entire career reading opponents' intentions in fractions of seconds, spotting tells, and preparing for attacks before they fully formed in his adversary's mind. His reaction was instantaneous and devastating in its simplicity. Mike stepped forward and knocked the man's hand away before it could settle on his holster. The movement was so quick, so precise, that it was over almost before it began. But the message was unmistakable. Any escalation toward weapons would be met with immediate and overwhelming response. "You even think about touching that gun," Mike said, his voice dropping to a level that seemed to vibrate in people's chests. "And I promise you, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." The officer's face flushed red, but whether from embarrassment, anger, or fear was impossible to determine. He tried to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "You threatening an officer now? That's a bad move, Tyson." Mike took another step forward, forcing the officer to step back again. The physical dynamics of the confrontation were shifting with each exchange, the balance of power tilting inexorably away from the man with the badge. "I'm not threatening," Mike replied with deadly calm. "I'm protecting my daughter. There's a difference." Behind them, Kayla stood in her father's shadow, her cheeks still throbbing from a slap, but her fear rapidly transforming into something else entirely: pride. She was witnessing her father do exactly what he'd always taught her to do: stand up for what's right, regardless of the consequences. The crowd around them had grown into a significant gathering. Students who had been heading home were now clustered in groups, their phones capturing every word and gesture. Some spoke directly into their cameras, providing real-time narration of events that were already going viral across social media platforms. "Did you see him hit that little girl? That's actually Mike Tyson. Someone call the news stations. This is going to be everywhere." The officer's lip curled as he tried to maintain some shred of authority. "You think this little show is going to save you when backup gets here?" Mike didn't even blink. His response was delivered with the confidence of someone who had faced down opponents across rings around the world, who had stared into cameras broadcasting to millions, who had never backed down from a fight in his life. "I don't need a show. I've got the truth, and the truth's all over those cameras." He gestured toward the students, many of whom now had their phones aimed steadily at the confrontation. The sound of sirens in the distance broke through the moment, like thunder announcing an approaching storm. The officer's expression shifted into something smug and self-satisfied. "Looks like we're about to have some company." But Mike's response revealed a man who had spent decades understanding that battles were won not just with fists, but with preparation, strategy, and unwavering commitment to truth. "Good," he said simply. "More witnesses." As the backup patrol cars screeched to a halt at the curb, their red and blue lights painting the late afternoon scene in alternating colors of urgency and authority, several uniformed officers jumped out. The first to approach immediately looked to the original officer, clearly expecting him to provide context and control. "What's going on here?" the new arrival asked, his hand resting casually on his radio. The officer who had struck Kayla wasted no time launching into his version of events. "This man assaulted me in front of the school, put his hands on me while I was trying to do my job. He needs to be taken in immediately." Mike let out a short, disbelieving laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. "That's what you're going with?" His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen enough lies and corruption to recognize it instantly. "You slapped my daughter across the face. You mocked her, threatened her, and now you want to twist it around." The newly arrived officers looked between the two men, clearly trying to piece together what had actually occurred. The crowd of students pressed closer, their phones still recording, their young voices beginning to rise in indignation as they processed what they were hearing. Kayla stepped out from behind her father's protective shadow, her voice trembling, but carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "He's lying," she said, pointing at the officer who had hit her. "He hit me first. Ask anyone here." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Several students shouted in agreement, holding their phones high like evidence in a court of law. One of them, a boy in a school hoodie, yelled above the others, "We got it on video. All of it." The original officer's face began to tighten with the first signs of real panic, but he still tried to maintain control of the narrative. "They're just kids," he said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "You really going to believe them over an officer?" Mike stepped closer, his imposing presence filling the space between them. When he spoke, his voice was steady but cutting, carrying the accumulated wisdom of someone who had spent his life learning that strength without righteousness was just brutality. "Over an officer who hits children? Yeah, I think they just might." The parking lot of Lincoln Elementary had transformed into an arena where truth and lies battled for supremacy. More patrol cars had arrived, their occupants quickly realizing that this wasn't a routine domestic disturbance or simple assault complaint. This was something that would define careers, test allegiances, and force everyone present to choose between protecting institutional power or standing up for what was right. Officer Richard Maloney, for that was the name embroidered on his uniform shirt, stood at the center of a rapidly deteriorating situation. Sweat had begun to form on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air. His initial confidence was cracking like ice under pressure, but he continued to double down on his version of events with the desperation of a man who knew his entire future hung in the balance. "Look at him," Maloney said, gesturing toward Mike with theatrical outrage. "He's a convicted felon, a has-been fighter with anger management problems. You're going to take his word over mine." His voice had taken on a shrill quality that contrasted sharply with the controlled fury radiating from Mike Tyson. But the backup officers weren't responding the way Maloney had expected. One of them, a veteran sergeant with 20 years on the force, was studying the crowd of students with their phones raised. His experienced eyes took in the scene, the number of witnesses, the clear fear and anger on the young faces, the way they instinctively positioned themselves behind Mike and Kayla rather than dispersing as students normally would when police arrived. "We need to see those videos," the sergeant said quietly, his words cutting through Maloney's protests like a knife through silk. From the school entrance, the security guard appeared, moving briskly across the parking lot, with the portable drive clutched in his weathered hand. His face was grim, carrying the weight of someone who had seen something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "Footage from the school cameras," he announced as he approached the group of officers. His voice was steady but carried an undertone of disgust. "The principal told me to bring it out here before anyone tries to make it disappear." The words hit Maloney like physical blows. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly as he processed the implications. School security cameras had captured everything: his casual littering, his escalating aggression toward a 12-year-old girl, and most damaging of all, the moment he struck a child. "You can't seriously be considering," Maloney began, but the sergeant cut him off with a raised hand. "Officer Maloney, I strongly suggest you remain silent until we review all available evidence." The sergeant's tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to command, but also the weariness of a man who had seen too many good cops tarnished by the actions of bad ones. Students pressed closer, their phones creating a digital wall of accountability. A girl with braided hair stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "I recorded it from when she first talked to him about the cigarette. He was mean to her from the very beginning, way before Mr. Tyson got here." Another student, a boy wearing a basketball jersey, nodded vigorously. "He kept getting closer and closer, trying to scare her. Then he hit her so hard we could hear it from across the parking lot." The sergeant accepted the security drive from the guard and looked around at the sea of young faces, each one representing not just a witness, but a future voter, a future juror, a future member of the community who would remember how law enforcement handled this moment. Mike remained silent throughout these exchanges, his massive frame still positioned protectively in front of Kayla. But his eyes never left Maloney, watching every micro-expression, every sign of panic or calculation that crossed the officer's face. He had learned long ago that the most powerful thing he could do in moments like this was simply exist. Let his presence speak volumes about the consequences of harming his family. Kayla, meanwhile, had found her voice in a way that surprised even herself. "He said where I come from. People don't talk to cops like that," she said, her young voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "But I was born right here. This is where I come from. And where I come from, we don't let bullies hurt people just because they have badges." The words hung in the air like an indictment not just of Maloney, but of every system that had allowed men like him to wear uniforms while harboring hatred in their hearts. Several of the backup officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognizing the broader implications of what was unfolding. One of the younger officers, barely out of the academy, approached the sergeant with obvious discomfort. "Sir, shouldn't we be separating the parties and taking statements?" The sergeant nodded slowly. "We will. But first, we're going to watch every second of available footage. In full. Together." He looked directly at Maloney as he spoke. "Transparency is the only way this ends well for anyone." Maloney's last desperate gambit came as he tried to play the brotherhood card. "Come on, guys. We stick together, right? It's us against them. It's always been us against them. You know how these people twist things. Make us look bad." The sergeant's response was immediate and crushing. "These people? You mean children? Citizens? People we swore to protect and serve?" His voice carried decades of disappointment and frustration. "Officer Maloney, you're relieved of duty pending a full investigation." As if choreographed, phones around the parking lot pinged with notifications. The first videos were already being shared across social media platforms, spreading like wildfire through networks of parents, community leaders, and activists who had been waiting for exactly this kind of documented evidence of police misconduct. Mike finally spoke, his voice cutting through the buzz of conversation and the electronic sounds of digital sharing. "This isn't about me being famous or him being a cop," he said, looking directly at each of the backup officers in turn. "This is about a grown man hitting a child and then lying about it. Everything else is just noise." The simple truth of his words seemed to settle over the scene like dust after an explosion. No amount of institutional loyalty, no appeals to authority or celebrity status, could change the fundamental fact that everyone present had witnessed or would soon see video evidence of an adult striking a child. As the sergeant began organizing the formal review of evidence, as students continued to share their videos, with growing excitement about their role in exposing injustice, and as news crews began arriving after being tipped off by viral social media posts, one thing became crystal clear to everyone present. This wasn't ending here in the school parking lot. This was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. 6 months later, the courthouse steps were bathed in golden afternoon sunlight as Mike Tyson emerged from the building with his arm around Kayla's shoulders. The heavy wooden doors behind them had witnessed the conclusion of a legal battle that had captivated the nation and sparked conversations about police accountability, racial justice, and the power of speaking truth to authority. The trial of Officer Richard Maloney had been a masterclass in the power of irrefutable evidence. Video footage from 17 different smartphones, security camera recordings from multiple angles, and testimony from dozens of witnesses had created an unshakable foundation of truth that no amount of legal maneuvering could undermine. Kayla had grown taller in the months since that terrible afternoon on the school lawn. Her voice was stronger now, her confidence tempered by the knowledge that sometimes doing the right thing requires tremendous courage. When she had taken the witness stand 3 days earlier, her testimony had been delivered with the poise of someone far beyond her years. "He threw his cigarette on our school lawn like it was his personal ashtray," she had told the packed courtroom, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the room. "When I asked him not to litter, he got angry. Not the kind of angry adults get when children are being disrespectful, the kind of angry that felt dangerous, like he hated me before he even knew my name." The prosecution had tried every angle they could think of to discredit her testimony, to paint her as a coached witness, or to suggest that Mike Tyson's celebrity status was somehow manipulating the legal process. But the evidence was overwhelming, and more importantly, it was diverse. Rich kids and poor kids, students of every ethnicity and background, all telling the same story with remarkable consistency. David Harris, the defense attorney Mike had hired, had built a case that went far beyond the simple assault charge. He had methodically demonstrated a pattern of behavior that suggested Maloney's actions weren't an isolated incident, but part of a broader problem with how he treated citizens, particularly young people of color. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, Harris had argued in his closing statement, his voice echoing through the courtroom with righteous indignation. This was a deliberate act by someone who believed his badge gave him the right to harm a child. Someone who thought his authority placed him above accountability. Someone who was so confident in his immunity that he didn't even consider the possibility of consequences. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman, a middle-aged woman who worked as a school principal in a neighboring district, had delivered the verdict with a voice that carried both sadness and determination. We find Officer Richard Maloney guilty on all charges: assault on a minor, child endangerment, abuse of authority, and filing a false police report. The sentencing had been equally swift and decisive. Judge Patricia Morrison, herself a mother of 3, had looked directly at Maloney as she delivered her judgment. Officer Maloney, you violated the most sacred trust placed in law enforcement, the protection of children. Your actions that day were not those of someone sworn to serve and protect, but of someone who believed power granted him the right to harm others. You are sentenced to 3 years in state prison and are permanently barred from serving in any law enforcement capacity anywhere in this state. Now, standing on the courthouse steps with reporters pressing forward and cameras flashing, Mike felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with justice. This hadn't been about revenge or celebrity privilege. It had been about ensuring that no other child would face what Kayla had experienced without consequences for the perpetrator. Mr. Tyson, what message do you hope this sends to other families? A reporter called out, microphone extended toward him. Mike considered the question carefully before answering. The message is simple, he said, his voice carrying easily across the crowd. When someone hurts your child, you fight back. Not with fists, not with violence, but with truth. You document everything. You find witnesses. You get lawyers. And you never, ever give up. Because children deserve adults who will stand up for them. Kayla tugged gently on her father's sleeve, and he leaned down so she could whisper in his ear. After listening for a moment, he smiled and straightened up. My daughter wants to say something, he announced, stepping slightly to one side so the microphones could pick up her voice. Kayla looked out at the sea of faces, cameras, and recording devices. 6 months ago, the attention would have terrified her. Now, she understood that her voice had power, not because she was Mike Tyson's daughter, but because she had chosen to use it when it mattered most. I want other kids to know that it's okay to speak up when adults do wrong things, she said, her voice steady and clear. Even if they're police officers or teachers or anyone else who's supposed to be in charge. Wrong is wrong, and staying quiet doesn't make it right. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. I was scared that day. Really scared. But my dad taught me that being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you do the right thing even when you are afraid. The crowd of supporters that had gathered on the courthouse steps erupted in applause. Many of them were families who had traveled from around the country to witness this moment, parents who had fought their own battles against institutional indifference, children who had found their own courage, inspired by Kayla's example. As they walked down the courthouse steps toward their waiting car, Mike reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It hadn't been easy. The legal process had been grueling, the media attention intense, and the emotional toll on Kayla significant. But she had grown stronger through it all. Her sense of justice refined, and her understanding of her own power expanded. Dad, Kayla said as they settled into the backseat of their car. Do you think he learned anything? Officer Maloney, I mean. Mike considered the question as their driver pulled away from the courthouse. I don't know, baby. Maybe. But the important thing isn't whether he learned something. It's whether other officers learn something. Whether other kids learn something. Whether the system learned something. The car moved through streets lined with supporters holding signs. Justice for Kayla. Children deserve protection. And truth wins. The local community had embraced their fight, recognizing it as part of a larger struggle for accountability and respect. As they drove home through neighborhoods where children played on lawns and walked to school without fear, Mike felt something he hadn't experienced since his boxing days. The satisfaction of knowing that his strength had been used for something greater than personal glory. This victory belonged not just to him and Kayla, but to every child who would grow up knowing that their voices mattered, that adults could be held accountable, and that justice, while sometimes slow, was still possible. The sun was setting behind them as they pulled into their driveway, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to stand up for what's right, and new chances to teach others that real strength comes not from the ability to hurt others, but from the courage to protect them. But tonight, they would sit together as a family, knowing that they had fought the good fight and won, not just for themselves, but for every child who deserved to walk home from school without fear, and for every parent who would never have to wonder whether their voice would be heard when their child needed protection. Justice had been served, but more importantly, a new generation had learned that their voices had power, their courage had value, and their truth could change the world.